Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Nerissa Kreher. She's a pediatric endocrinologist, and she's the founder of the Industry MD Coach. She wrote the Kevin MD article, How Physicians Can Find Jobs in the Pharmaceutical and Biotechnology Industries. Nerissa, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and your journey to where you are today?
Sure, happy to. So I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, as you mentioned, and during my fellowship, I knew that I wanted to enter a clinical research career. So I stayed on at Riley Hospital for Children, where I trained for a year as a junior faculty, and then my family needed to move to the Boston area. And of course, I pursued an academic clinical research career that unfortunately or fortunately did not come to fruition. So there weren't a lot of roles available for pediatric endocrinologists at the academic centers at the time. So I ended up in the pharmaceutical industry, and my first role was a medical affairs director position, and I was supporting a growth hormone product. So it was a very natural transition. And in that, in medical affairs, I was focused on a phase 4 clinical registry looking at safety and efficacy of this growth hormone. And soon after, a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to move to a different company and do more clinical development work. So, of course, that is then focused in phase 1 through phase 3 clinical trials with products that aren't yet approved through a regulatory agency. And I did that strategically to really round out my experience in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, 15 years later, I have my second chief medical officer role. That's much more of a strategic role. And I've also gone from larger pharma biotech companies into smaller companies, often private, supported by venture capital funds, and also had an opportunity to take one of those companies through the public markets doing an IPO. So I've really been able to span large to small biotech as well as private and public, which has been a lot of fun.
So what are some of the qualities for physicians who choose a pharmaceutical or a biotech non-clinical role? Do you find that a lot of these physicians go into these roles straight from residency, or do you find that some physicians have a clinical career first and transition later on in their careers?
Yes, it can be both. So we see people transition early and we see people transition later. One of my mentors and persons that I looked up to during my training was a professor who spent her whole career and in retirement moved into the pharmaceutical industry, and then compare that to me. I moved in a year after fellowship. So there's a wide spectrum. And it's a question I often get, is there a certain background, a certain specialty? And really, there is a huge variety of different physicians in our industry.
And what are some common roles within the pharmaceutical and biotech industry for physicians?
Sure. So I group them into 3 different major roles. The first is clinical development. So again, that's usually focused on products that aren't yet approved. You're writing clinical trials, you're doing a lot of regulatory work to get a product approved. Then there's medical affairs. That's a more outward facing role that physicians can have. So you're liaising with key opinion leaders in the space. You might be running advisory boards to get information from physicians that are in the specialty of interest. And then the other area is drug safety or pharmacovigilance. And so that, of course, is a much more inward focused role where physicians utilize their background and knowledge to look at safety signals from a variety of drugs.
So let's now transition into your Kevin MD article, How Physicians Can Find Jobs in the Pharmaceutical and Biotechnology Industries. Now, for those who haven't read your article, can you just walk my audience through it and maybe share the story of why you decided to write it?
Sure. So I tell the story of my transition, which I've shared, and then I talk about the fact that there's a need for physicians in the pharmaceutical industry. And at the same time, I think there's a need for some of our physician colleagues looking for different ways to use their medical training and residency training. And the pharmaceutical industry should be on that list of non-clinical careers. So as we really saw COVID hitting, lots more physician burnout, I realized that I was sitting between two different sets of people, my physician colleagues and the pharmaceutical industry that I know very well. And I decided that I would build the industry MD coach to help link these two groups of people together that really don't have a great link. So that was really the impetus of the article, was to be able to share with physicians that this is a career path that they should consider.
So if I'm a physician and maybe I'm furloughed or maybe I'm thinking of making a transition out of clinical medicine, where do I start and what do I do?
So first, think about your personality. Of those three different areas that I mentioned, are you more of an introvert? Are you more of an extrovert? Do you like delving into lots of detailed data? Or are you someone that thinks more big picture? So if you think about your personality, you can see how someone that likes delving into data might gravitate towards drug safety. Someone that's more of an extrovert and more interested in strategy might gravitate more towards medical affairs. Someone that's been in academics and run clinical trials as a principal investigator might gravitate towards clinical development. So that would be one approach, is thinking about your background and your interests. The other thing to consider is, what kind of specialist are you? Or if you're not a specialist, what kinds of disease states do you take care of? And do you enjoy learning about and talking about? One thing that I have clients do is think about a list of the top 10 drugs that they prescribe, and then match those drugs to the companies that manufacture and market those drugs. And those might be companies that you want to take a look at. What job openings do they have for physicians? So those are a couple of tactical ways to think about all of the different functional areas that you might pursue, as well as specific companies that you might pursue as well.
Typically, is there any additional training that's needed for physicians who transition out of clinical medicine and into the pharmaceutical and biotech industry?
That's a great question. So I would say no. Certainly, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, you'll see that I have my MBA. I did an executive MBA during my career, so I actually was able to have one of the companies pay for my executive MBA. It's not at all necessary. I did it because I wanted to learn more about the business side of things, but it's not at all necessary. The other thing that you might see are leadership courses. In medical affairs, there are some certifications that you can get. Those are nice to haves, but absolutely not necessary.
And what's the life like of a physician in a non-clinical role in one of these industries? How does compensation compare? And what's the day-to-day life like compared to someone in clinical medicine?
Sure. So the day-to-day life can really vary depending on the role. So a safety physician, of course, is likely not to do a whole lot of travel, whereas a medical affairs physician might do more travel, and clinical development physicians kind of in between. I've had the opportunity to really travel around the world, which I've enjoyed. That's been a great, important part of the career for me, but it's not necessary. So some people ask, well, do I have to travel? No, there are certainly roles that you don't have to. I would say one of the key differences is the variety of things you do every day and the flexibility you have. So I don't have a patient waiting for me at 8:30 in the morning. I have a little more flexibility about, when do I start my day versus having to be in the clinic. 1 hour, I might be thinking about something very detail oriented, like writing a protocol inclusion and exclusion criteria. And the next hour, I might be preparing for a presentation to a group of investors. And so it's invigorating from the standpoint of really being able to do things different day in and day out in a huge variety of different things that I think really keeps my brain going and keeps me learning all the time.
And in general, how does the compensation compare to, say, a physician in a clinical role?
Sure. So, of course, that's going to vary a lot based on the specialty. So, I would say a starting role for most physicians in industry, associate director to director level role is probably going to be in the low to mid 200s. So, if you're an internist or another kind of specialist, a neurologist, maybe that's very comparable. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, that might not be comparable. But the important thing to know is that the compensation package isn't only about your base salary. There's a bonus that most people get every year that can be a large part of the compensation as well. So, somewhere from on the low side at a starting position, 15% might go all the way up to 25%. So you can see how that quickly would add to your salary. And then importantly, lots of different benefits like 401k matching. There might be stock purchase plans that you can buy company stock at a discount. In smaller companies, maybe stock options. So it's really important to think about the overall compensation package and not just that base salary.
And in general, how competitive are these roles? Do you have a lot of applicants for these non-clinical physician roles, or is it fairly wide open?
Right. So certainly we need more physicians in the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. So from a competitive standpoint there, we do need more people. So it gets competitive when it gets, higher up, or if people are looking for a specific type of specialty or a specific skill set. If you're looking at, for example, a clinical development role, and you're looking for someone who has 5 or 10 years worth of experience in clinical development, that's when it can start to get kind of competitive. But again, there are a number of roles where physicians can enter without pharmaceutical experience.
And in terms of looking for these roles specifically, do they contact the companies directly? Are there recruiters, or do they find coaches like yourself? What's the best way for physicians to find these opportunities?
I think that going directly to the company, that certainly can work. A lot of companies have their own internal HR. That's tough though, because you can get lost in the mix. You submit it into the ethos and you don't hear back and you don't know what's going on. So if you can find a recruiter that specializes in hiring physicians for the pharmaceutical industry, I think that's a really important step. Certainly, my business is a very niche business. There aren't many people like me doing this. My network includes some of those recruiters, so that's one of the things I offer to clients, is being able to build that network more easily for them. So I think you can do it in multiple different ways, but certainly finding a recruiter can help you get past some of the blank space of just submitting to a company website.
We're talking to Nerissa Kreher. She's a pediatric endocrinologist, and she's the founder of the Industry MD Coach. She wrote the Kevin MD article, How Physicians Can Find Jobs in the Pharmaceutical and Biotechnology Industries. Nerissa, can you share some of the challenges physicians face transitioning into this non-clinical role?
So one of the things that I coach people about is making sure they understand that you have to work as a team player in the pharmaceutical industry. It's typically highly matrixed, and the physician is no longer the final decision maker. So that's one really important consideration, is that even when they feel that their idea or their approach would be the best, it may not always be the approach that the team decides to take. So you have to bring a level of humility, and you also have to bring the interest in being a forever learner and learning from other team members. So I think that's one thing that the transition requires, which is different than in clinical practice, where the physician is oftentimes the ultimate decision maker, or at least very high on the decision-making totem pole.
And my final question, Nerissa, what is your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
So my take-home message is two parts. One, if you're interested in the pharmaceutical industry, really build out your network of people that work in our industry. So think about building your relationships with the sales representative from a drug company, from the medical science liaison that might visit your office. Really build out that network. And finally, as physicians, we're perfectionists. And people often want to check off all the different tick boxes of a job description before they would consider applying. And it's really important that we let some of that perfectionism go and allow ourselves to take a chance and apply, even if we don't have that 3 years of pharmaceutical experience that the job description might say. It's still worth applying and trying.
And how can people reach you?
Right. So on my website, the Industry MD Coach, I also have a Facebook page, the same name, Industry MD Coach. And my email address is industrymdcoach@gmail.com.
Nerissa, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kevin.